For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Sir, they said, always give us this bread. Then Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks.
Good. Amen. You may be seated. I'm glad you're here this morning, and I'm excited to continue to talk about this I Am series, where Jesus speaks in his own words about who he says he is, not who we think he is or we come up with. But I don't know, if you were to come to the world, if you were to enter the world and have to create a first impression, if this is your first thing you were going to say to somebody, I don't know what your first impressions are, like what your normal go-to thing is that is the first thing that you're going to say to somebody. My guess it probably want to be something like this. This is something like that you probably wouldn't say right off the bat. But it is weird. Like, I don't know if you ever tried to make a good first impression. I remember there have been a few times in my life where I've really tried to do something like really good or cool, and I've just made a fool of myself. Where I've walked into a room and anyways. I have a friend who he recently texted me, and this has like haunted me since this. He posted something about this, and then he texted me about it, that he walked into a Subway recently, like a Subway restaurant, and he said he hadn't been in that one before, and he just walked in, and as soon as he walked in, he said, I'd like a meat-long football. And he said, that's what I said, a meat-long football. And he said, I just walked out. I just walked out of that Subway. I've never gone back in. I will never step foot in there. And it's haunted me since then. Like, I practice. I don't know about you. I walk into Starbucks sometimes. I practice my order before I say it, because I'm like, I don't want to mess this up, right? Or I'll go somewhere and I'll think about what would be the first thing I should talk to this person about. What is the conversation I can bring up? How can I impress this person, or how can I at least make this person feel like I'm engaging with them? What are some things I should know, some talking points, whatever. And when Jesus shows up at the beginning of his ministry, he starts with these I am statements. And John catalogs 7 different statements. And there's a reason for that, and we'll talk about it as we go through the series. John catalogs 7 statements from Jesus of him saying, I am this. So whatever you think I am, that's not who I am. I am this. And usually those 7 statements are attached to a certain sign, or what we might call a miracle, but John calls them signs. There's usually a sign and then a statement. It goes sign, then statement. So there's usually a sign that Jesus does, not a miracle, and we'll talk about why that's important. But there's a sign, then there's a statement that Jesus makes. He says, I am this. Whatever you think, whatever you've been told, that's not who I am. Let me tell you who I am. And he shows up on the scene, and his first impression, his meat-long football, right, is like this first statement that he makes in John chapter 6, verse 35. If you saw that, the last line that Stephanie just read for us, the very end of that phrase, he says, then Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. I'm not going to lie to you. This is a weird first statement. To come in like, you would expect Jesus to come in and be like, his first statement would be like, I am, awesome. I am a savior. I am super duper. I am the guy you've been looking for. I am whatever you want to think he's going to say. That's where he would start, but he doesn't start with that. He starts with, I am the bread of life, which is like, I don't know about you, it feels a little weird to me. Now, there's a reason for this, and I think this is why he starts there. There's a couple reasons some people would say. First is because of the history that we have. If you have your Bible, I'd love for you to turn to John chapter 6 if you have it, and just kind of stick with me. But we're going to put our finger in there for a second because we're going to kind of hop around just a little bit. But Jesus shows up on the scene in John 6, and he says this because this is the history we have. The history of God speaking to us. Remember, God has multiple names, and God speaks in the Old Testament to us about who he is. And the first name we see God give is also very similar. There's a history in this. In Genesis chapter 22, if you're not familiar with the story, we see that God talks to Abraham. And he talks to Abraham about, I'm going to give you a son. And Abraham's like, but I'm pretty old. And God's like, don't worry, I got this. And then Abraham tells his wife, we're going to have a son. And she goes, but you're really old. And in fact, she laughs at him, which has got to be really hurtful. Like, I don't know how your marriage recovers from that. Like, she's like, you're really old. And he's like, but I think we can do this. And she's like, good one. Like that feels great. God gives them the son, Isaac, right? And he is everything that God has provided. Everything God promised has now been provided in the form of Isaac. And when God gives him Isaac, suddenly he sends Abraham to a mountain to sacrifice the one thing that he had. The thing that God had provided for him more than anything. He says, I want you to give that up for me. Remember, and Abraham takes him. Now, there's a lot of foreshadowing here. This whole story is an account foreshadowing Jesus. Because if you pay attention, right, it says 3 times in the story, by the way, it says that Abraham took his son, his only son. I don't know if that sounds familiar, like only begotten type of language. And he sends him to the top of a mountain, and he makes Isaac carry his own death contraption to the top of a hill where he's going to be sacrificed. Then they get there, they stay there for 3 days. I don't know if you're seeing any imagery here. If you know the whole story of Jesus, there's a couple things going on here. They get there, and right before Abraham sacrifices his son, foreshadowing of God sacrificing his own son, Abraham is stopped. And it says this, and it says that Abraham is stopped. He's given a ram instead. It says, sacrifice this ram. Do not sacrifice your son. There's a big statement there where he says, now I know. And we can talk about that for like forever. Now I know that you are faithful. And then it says, so Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. This is the first name of God that we see in the Old Testament. It's the name of provision. This is, if you know the word, it's Jehovah Jireh, right? Anybody know this phrase? Jehovah Jireh. Yireh is how you would say that in Hebrew. Jehovah Jireh, and he is the provider. That's the first thing God is known as, because it says the Lord will provide. That phrase is Jehovah Jireh right there. And to this day, that place is where God provided. So some people believe it's the history. That's why Jesus is talking about this here, is because the history of God's own statements about himself start with provision. That's where he begins. And it might be because of history that Abraham's doing this, or that Jesus is doing this. It might be because of Abraham's story, and he wants to be in line with what God set up in the Old Testament, the pattern of God's statements about himself. Maybe. I also think, though, if I'm being honest with you, I think it's not so much about history. I think it's about right now. I think it's because we live in every single day this exact thing, right? Like, we constantly are worried that we will not have enough. It's just the human condition, right? John Maynard Keynes, who is, considered one of the best and brightest minds in economics of all time. If you don't know who that is, John Maynard Keynes was born into the Depression era, and he kind of grew up in the Depression era. And he was actually the one that most people kind of give credit to for how we got out of the Depression and how America moved forward. And his writings have been used every single time we've had an economic crisis. The first writings people go to is John Maynard Keynes to see how we get out of that. He is a brilliant mind in this stuff. But what's interesting is after the Depression, he died in 1948, but after the Depression, he wrote a whole thesis that once we got out of the Depression, we would never see anything like that again, because we would always have too much from that point forward. We'd have too much stuff. He's like, look at the way the economy is working. Look at the way that the world is working. We're going to have so much stuff, we'll never fall into a depression again, which is adorable, isn't it? Like the optimism. You got to give him credit for that. Because I don't know if you've lived through the things I've lived through even. I'm not even that old, but I've seen a few good recessions and depressions. Because the problem isn't that we wouldn't have enough stuff, isn't it? Stuff isn't the issue. It's not a stuff issue. I mean, you can read all the economics on this, but I mean, again, right around the Industrial Revolution is the first time that we believe that we went from having too much demand on the supply chain, like it was too much demand, not enough supply. And that was the way the world worked for literally 6,000, 8,000 years, was we had too much demand on getting stuff, but not enough supply. Right around the Industrial Revolution is the first time we saw those things flip. And what happened is we actually had too much supply for the demand, and that's when we started marketing things. That's why you need a new phone every year. That's why there's a new model of car every single year. That's why we put Pro behind something, or S behind something, or a number behind something. So that you have to get this one, but then you need this one next, right? We moved from actually having too much demand to having too much supply, and now we have to market that out. That's why you need new furnishings in your house every season for people to come over. Because, I mean, if you don't have a pillow that says, it's fall, y'all, then you're out. Like, are you even trying? See, the problem isn't stuff. Stuff would be an easy issue to fix, actually. And God actually will talk about it. The stuff issue is what he's fixed over and over again. The soul part of it is the part that we have to fix. It's that our souls consistently are like, we need more. We're afraid we don't have enough. We have this scarcity mindset. We need a little bit more. For being honest, this is what the original sin is, if you read Genesis 3, right? God says he gives a garden with everything that's needed to Adam and Eve. Everything that they could need is provided. And he says, here's all the stuff, but you just don't need this one thing. You don't need it, but you want it. There's a big difference between those two words. And suddenly they start to worship not the creator who set up everything, but the creation. And they see fruit and they're like, that looks real good. And it's like, but you could have more than you have now. You could be more than you are now. You could ascend to a higher level. You could know. And they actually listen to a talking snake, which is a real weird situation, and I would not recommend it. If you ever find a talking snake, don't listen to it, and also stop doing the drugs you're on, because that's it's a situation, right? But they listen to the creation instead of the creator, and they take in the creation instead of the creator. And so what they do is they worship the wrong thing. And by doing so, suddenly they think we'll have more. It's the original sin. We need more. We always want more. And the problem with that story is not that it happened, but that it happens, right? We still do the same thing every single day. We're still wanting just a little bit more. We want more stuff. And so when Jesus shows up on the scene, I think what he's confronting here is not just the history of God saying he'll provide, not starting there, but it's because that's not a sin that just happened then. It's a sin that happens to us every single day. I mean, if we're being honest, if we were just to be honest in this room for a second, maybe I'm the only one, maybe this is just for me. Have you not had, like, in the last, I don't know, give yourself a month, 3 months, 6 months. Have you not had, like, a couple sleepless nights over something? Am I the only one? Maybe I'm the only one. I'm not the only one. Like, you just kind of stay up and you can't get your mind off of something, and you're like, I'm fine. And the next day you're like, I don't know what it was that kept me up, but you know exactly what it was that kept you up. Maybe you've had a few of those moments where you've just had so much stress, you can't think about anything but the thing that you are worried about. It happens. It's still happening. Maybe it's something in your job right now. Maybe it's a performance issue in your job or something you feel like you're not doing enough. Maybe you feel like somebody else is getting the promotion you were supposed to get. Maybe you feel like it's something in school right now where you're like, oh, I gotta do this or else my whole future falls apart. And man, we love that narrative in America, don't we? If you don't get this grade right now on this test, like literally everything's over for the rest of eternity. You will be a failure. Maybe it's something like a diagnosis that just keeps you up at night over and over and over again. At least for me, this is probably where I struggle the most. Because Jesus comes along. It's real frustrating. I don't know if you ever read it. He gives these verses where he's like, do not worry about tomorrow. Good one. That's hilarious. Are we serious? Like, that's a real thing? You're going to say that? He says this in the Sermon on the Mount. Do not worry about tomorrow. It really feels like a joke, doesn't it? In our day and age, in our society, that's like the hardest thing for us to do because we're so used to having so much control. I think we're so used to trying to manipulate and handle every single thing on our own. And we're like, I can fix it. If I just throw enough money at it, if I just worry or think hard enough about it, I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to have all the stuff I need. I'm going to do it all myself. I love the Elizabeth Gilbert line, though, where she says, and yes, this is the author of Eat, Pray, Love, so don't hear me wrong. She is. And everybody loves Julia Roberts, so it all works out. But here, this is what she says. She says, you're afraid of surrendering that. Because you don't want to lose control, but you never had control. All you had was anxiety. And if you think about it, I'm just going to throw it out there. The thing that you're worried about, the thing that you're so scared of, the scarcity mindset we have, that nothing's going to work, that God's not going to provide, it's not going to come through again, this isn't going to work for me. The more we think about that, I would say that most of the time we don't have any control over that in the first place. We feel better because we're worrying about it for some reason. But at the end of the day, we didn't have any control. All we had was anxiety over it. And so when we worry about that child, Some of you know exactly what I'm talking about, where you worry about the child that you have, that you're like, how do I take care of this child? Or they're going the wrong path, or they're not going to get the thing they need, or whatever. And some of you, it's adult children, where you're like, how do I deal with this thing? Some of you, it's your parents and their health or their situations. This is what we worry about over and over and over again. And when God shows up, he doesn't just show up in provision in this one story of Abraham, but his provision is laid out in a specific way. He gives a thing that is the symbol of his provision. If you have your Bible, again, you can leave your finger there in John 6 because we'll come back to it. But if you go back to the book of Exodus, you guys know probably where I'm heading with this. But in Exodus, God puts provision into a visual and formidable way of understanding him. Like it's a real thing. He gives us a tangible expression of what provision looks like. So in Exodus chapter 12, it says this. This is the Passover feast. Remember, this is like Passover here. So God's about to set up the Passover saying, I'm going to rescue you from Egypt. The Israelites are enslaved. They've been making bricks for about 400 years for the Egyptians. And he says, I'm going to take you out of that place from slavery to freedom. You're not going to be building bricks anymore, but you're going to be living an entirely different life. We're going to go from slaves into a superpower that the world will see as Israel. That's what we're going to do. But when we do that, the first thing we're going to do is make this meal. And this meal is going to be a reminder to you of that. And it says this in verse 15. It says, for 7 days you were to eat bread made without yeast. And he says on the first day you remove the yeast from your house. And there's different things in the Bible where yeast is kind of seen as a symbol of sin. But he says, I want you to make and eat bread for 7 days. Some of you are like, that sounds fantastic. Like, where do I sign up for that? This is the part of the Bible that is carb loading. Now, to be fair, they are about to run away from the Egyptians. And he might be like, get some carbs in you because we got a long run to go. You know, maybe that's what's happening here. But it's like, great, right? We're going to eat bread. This is the first sign. This is where he shows up in the Passover. But then the bread doesn't end there, right? If you flip over just a little bit past the Exodus itself, where they have now run away, they're actually in the desert. In Genesis chapter 16, we see that it says the Lord, I don't know who did the verse. I don't know. This is like a super Bible nerdy thing. I love this. The people who put in like the verse numbers to the Bible, I would love to know who they were and why they thought they should break lines at certain places. This is its own verse. Verse 16, or chapter 16, verse 11 is just the Lord said to Moses. It's a powerful verse, isn't it? Like if you're looking for a life verse, this is it. Really good verse, okay? The Lord said to Moses, now verse 12, I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. This is a sign. Notice this. This is a sign. The sign is not, here's the temptation we have, and this is what the Israelites will struggle with, is that they will start to fall in love with the bread, but what does God tell them? He's sending it so that then you will know that I am the Lord your God. He's not sending the bread so you fall in love with bread. He's sending bread so that you remember who he is. That you know about his character, about who he is. That you're reminded of what he has done, of his faithfulness over and over again. And the Israelites, just like us, they will fall in love with the bread that they get, but not the creator behind the bread. Once again, we fall in love with the creation and we miss the creator himself. Right here, we see that. That's he's worried about that right off the bat. You're going to fall in love with that bread. You're going to think that's what this is all about. You're going to want the provision without the provider. You're going to want the creation without the creator. That's what's going to happen to you. And so he sets up a sign here. This is a sign pointing to something else. This isn't just a sign for itself, but it's a sign pointing to something else. And then if you flip over to verse 35, I'll just kind of fill you in. I'll skip through some of this so we can kind of move through it quicker. It says this, the Israelites ate manna for 40 years until they came to a land that was settled. They ate manna until they reached the border of Canaan. And again, if you have your Bible open, there's another great verse right beneath that I don't know why they included as its own verse. It just says, an omer is 1/10 of an ephah. In case you were wondering how much an omer was. Again, if you're looking for a life verse, this is a good one. An omer is 1/10 of an ephah. So maybe get that tattooed on you somewhere. It's really powerful, okay? Hang on to that one. It's a good verse. The Israelites ate manna for 40 years. That's a long time to eat bread. It's a long time to be stuck in the wilderness together. And God continues to provide over and over and over again. They've gone from slaves to a superpower. They literally entered the desert with no economy, with nothing of their own, where they were to make money or any way that they could provide for themselves. But God provided, and they moved from slaves to superpower. They've built up an entire understanding of as a nation, an entire economy within that nation. They have an entire rule structure and the symbolism of all of that is that God provided bread for them. That's where this is coming from. And they had a belief. So this turns into a belief that actually many of the scholars, the Jewish scholars, believe that what would happen is if God provided bread then, while they were under oppression of Egypt, that he would do it again. And actually, this might sound a little weird, but there was a belief in the Jewish tradition at this time, when Jesus shows up on the scene, that whoever would be the Messiah would bring with them bread. Like bread would fall from heaven again, just like it did with Moses. There's actually a belief this would happen. Baruch, who was a scholar and a Hebrew writer, this was in the exile after Jerusalem had fallen to Babylon. He was about 5 years later writing than what we see of Daniel. But he writes in this Baruch piece, he had a midrash where he actually says that what we would see is, it says this, and it will happen at that time that the treasury of manna will come down again. This is talking about the Messiah. When the Messiah shows up, manna is going to fall down again from on high. And they will eat of it in those years because these are they who will have arrived at the consummation of time. He's saying when this Messiah shows up, this is what it's going to look like. He's literally going to have bread fall. In fact, there were multiple Hebrew writers, and we don't have time to go through all of them, who would write the same thing. When the Messiah shows up, guess what he's going to bring? He's going to bring bread. And some of you are like, that sounds like a great Messiah. Like, that sounds perfect. He'll bring baguettes or whatever. It's going to be a good Messiah, right? That's what we're looking for. So when Jesus is here in John chapter 6, he's speaking to Jews who are looking for that exact thing. That's how God provided in the past, and that's how he's going to provide now. He gave us bread before, and now he should do it again. He should give us that. So in John 6, the story that we're seeing in John chapter 6, if you go back to John 6 with me, is the story that you're very familiar with. Remember, there's a sign, and then there's a statement. There's the sign and then the statement. The sign itself is a story you're probably familiar with. It's the feeding of the 5,000. The feeding of the 5,000 has just happened in John chapter 6. So Jesus takes a boy's lunch. He does this really cool miracle where he turns it into enough food for 5,000 people, right? We kind of know the story. And when he gives it to everybody, I want you to see a few things as we go through that story. And then I also want you to see, who is this for? What does this mean? And then how do we respond to it? Okay, we're going to try to walk through those three things. Who is this for? What does this mean? And how do we respond to it? Okay, so back to John 6 with me if you would. In John chapter 6, we'll start right at the beginning here. We're going to skip through some verses because it's a long story. But I want you to just remember, verse 1, sometime after this, John crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias, and the great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. Now I want you to see this verse. This is critical. We would miss this every day. But I promise you, any reader in John's time, especially a Jewish reader, they would have never missed this line. The Jewish Passover festival was near. Like that meant something. What did we just read in Exodus? What did God provide? He says, you're going to eat bread for 7 days. You're going to take in this Passover feast. People were looking for a Messiah. They're eagerly trying to figure out if this is the one or not. And there's a Passover coming up, which was the sign they'd all been looking for. We would miss this verse, but I promise you, any Jewish reader, that would be like the first thing they would zone in on, is that we have to know about this. Something's up. The Passover is near. Now, this story is so important. The feeding of the 5,000 is so important that it shows up in all four Gospels. Not many stories do. Only 8 to 10 stories, like if you kind of take pieces of them, show up in all four Gospels. This is one that does. The feeding of the 5,000 shows up all 4 times. If you skip down just a little bit into the verses here, let's skip over to verse 12. It says this. When they had all had enough to eat, so after the feeding of the 5,000, he said to the disciples, gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. And after the people saw the sign Jesus performed, notice this is a sign, Jesus performed, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who is come into the world. Surely this must be that prophet, because he performed a sign. I want to remind you, a sign does not point, it's not a miracle. A miracle is just pointing to the thing itself. This is what just happened. A sign points to something else. I don't know if you've ever seen a sign. You get more understanding about a sign. I remember there was a store I used to go into as a kid. It was called the Shoshone Malt and Liquor Store. I didn't go there for the liquor part. I was too young. But I would go there for the malt part. And the Shoshone, it was in Wyoming where I lived for a little while. And I would go in there every day, and they had signs everywhere that just said, you break it, you buy it. On everything. Like things you couldn't even break. Like it was like stuff, it would be like on bubble gum. Like you break it, you buy it. And I was like, yeah, how do you even do that? I was terrified of that store. I was always afraid I was going to have to buy everything in that store. The only spot that was different was in the magazine section. It said, you read it, you buy it. I was like, now that sign, it tells me something not just about them. It tells me something about not just about the magazine or about the gum or about the things I could break. It tells me about the people behind it, right? It lets me know a little bit about what they're thinking. It gives me an insight to them, right? These aren't exactly fun folks. I walked into a urinal stall the other day. They have a lot of fun signs in there. And there was one that just said, we aim to please. You aim to please. And I was like, that's pretty good, actually. And I need that above mine because I have a son. So like we all need that one. I liked it. It tells you a little bit about the people behind it. Like there's funny stuff. It's whatever. There's a sign. It's pointing us to something else, right? And you're figuring this out. Like we have to, we figure out something about the person behind the sign. That's what Jesus is doing here. That's why John never calls these miracles. He has 7 signs, and then they point to the significance of the person behind it, to Jesus himself. So he creates this sign, and then he says, after that, when he says this line, it says, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. Now I want you to see something going on here. In this moment, they are in Galilee, it tells us. So he is with religious people. What I want to talk about really quickly is who is this for? And hopefully this isn't too bad of a rabbit trail, but I want to talk about who is this for. Because those 12 baskets represent something here. So when he's standing there in Galilee, this is a Jewish audience. These are people who have been in on this for a long time. These are people that consider themselves people who have been spiritually chosen by God. They're better than those others. They are the ones who are pure. They see themselves as good, because God has chosen them. And so when Jesus does this miracle in front of them, they've been looking for a Messiah, and they see him as a Messiah because they've been looking for this type of thing. So they're starting to figure out, is this our guy or not? And they actually say, surely he is. Now there's 12 baskets left over because any Jew would have understood that there's 12 tribes of Israel in the Old Testament, which is why most people believe Jesus chose 12 disciples. He picks 12 disciples, and so there's a basket for each disciple, whether it's for them to take home as a goodie bag or they get a doggy box, whatever it is, that's their thing. Like they get to have part in this, and everybody sees there is a completion of this Jewish understanding of the 12 that is a perfect number for them. But Jesus isn't done there. That's not where Jesus ends. Because I don't know if you've ever read this story in the book of Matthew. Again, this story shows up in multiple places. There's a really weird thing that happens in Matthew. In the book of Matthew, there's the feeding of the 5,000, but later on, just a chapter later, there is the feeding of the 4,000. Did anybody ever notice this? It's real weird. Now, a lot of people talk about what's called the Markan sandwich, which is in the book of Mark. Mark tells a story, then he has a couple of conversations that Jesus does, then he does the other side of the sandwich, and he closes the story. He bookends it with story. In this case, the first part of the bread would be feeding the 5,000, then a couple of conversations, then the other piece of bread, pun intended, I guess, the other piece of bread is the feeding of the 4,000. That's what Matthew's doing. And if you'll indulge me for just a second, I want you to see what Jesus is setting up here, because really it's actually pretty fascinating. If you go to Matthew to chapter 14, what you'll see, and maybe you're not like a sandwich person, like bread on each side, but maybe you're like an Oreo person, right? There's an Oreo, there's this side, then there's the cream filling, then another side. In chapter 14 of Matthew, we actually see the same thing. And what I want you to see is if you pay attention to this, or Matthew 15, I'm sorry. In Matthew 15, what I want you to see is if you just look at the headers, if you have your Bible open, I want you to see the headers. You don't have to go through every single thing in here, but I do want you to see what's going on here. Because it says in Matthew 15, sorry, I don't have my Bible properly marked apparently. There we go. Matthew 15. This is what it says. In 14, it says, Jesus feeds 5,000 people. In 14, verse 13. You'll see just the header. Jesus feeds 5,000. Same story we're talking about. Then we go to the next section, which says Jesus walks on water. Pretty fascinating thing that happens next, because they're crossing the lake. Remember, Jesus is like, I'm tired. You guys go cross the lake. Then he shows up walking on the water. What's interesting is the disciples at this point are terrified of him, which is interesting to me because they just saw him feed 5,000 people. Like you'd think they'd be like, hey, we're in a storm. Jesus is going to take care of it. Instead, they're terrified again. And Jesus walks on water out to them, and he stands with them. Now, they're across the lake at this point. I want you to see this. They cross the lake. Then the next thing that happens is chapter 15, verse 1, that which defiles. This is a whole section on purity. It's about who's in and who's out. Jesus is now preaching to people outside of the church a little bit. He's saying this is who's pure inside, and this is who's pure outside. This is who decides who's pure and who's good. And he says, it's not you, by the way. It's me. I'll decide who's pure and who's good. Then the next thing that happens is the faith of a Canaanite woman. A woman comes up to him, and she is a Canaanite. And what's interesting is a Canaanite would have been considered one of the worst people. Canaanites were mortal enemies of Jews. They had inhabited the same land at different times. They had fought over the same land. They had literally shed blood over the same land multiple times. And the Canaanites were considered one of the seven nations that were there in Israel before Israel took its place. There was a 7 there where they were part of this 7 nations, okay? So if you're like a White Stripes fan, you're like 7 Nation Army, that's where this comes, it's like a 7 nation thing. That's where this comes from, okay? So there's 7 nations that took Israel before Israel had landed there. And the Canaanites were considered the worst. What's interesting is this Canaanite woman comes up to Jesus, and out of character for any Jew, Jesus actually first says this, it's not right to take children's bread. Notice the bread. I just want you to see this. And if you're following along, he says it's not right to take bread, speaking of maybe himself, and throw it to dogs. Most people in that room would have thought he's talking about her as one of the dogs. But then she says, yes, it is, Lord. Whoa. I don't know if you noticed this. She just disagreed with Jesus. This doesn't usually go well. She says, no, we want the bread. Canaanites, we want the bread too. We want you as well. And then she said, even the dogs eat crumbs that fall from the master's table. And then Jesus says to her, which this would have been an affront to every Jew in the room, woman, you have great faith. He said that to a Canaanite. You have great faith. The person you thought was out is now in. He says, your request has been granted. The person you thought was out is now in. The purity thing that you're worried about, that person that was out is now in. And then Jesus finishes that bit with the feeding of the 4,000. Do you see the sandwich happening here? We start with 12 baskets of the Jews that he was with, but now we're moving the story outside of just the people who he chose and who would have been considered chosen. The religious people were not the only people he went to. He crosses a lake, and when he crosses the lake, he gets to people who are not those that would have been chosen by him, those that had always been the good religious folks. In fact, when he gets there, he says, you don't decide who's pure, I do, and this woman who you think should not be is. She is part of it as well, and let's take this show on the road. Let's not just feed the 5,000, let's feed the 4,000. And you might be like, why does he feed 4,000? Like, why would he do that again? Is he a one-trick pony? Does he only have one thing going on? Does he only have one miracle he can really pull off? Like, why does he do it again? Is he just really good at catering? Like, he's just like, I really would love to have a catering business on the side. Is that what's going on here? No, there's something much deeper. Because when he feeds the 4,000, and he gets to the end of the 4,000 in verse 34, it says this, how many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. And guess what? Guess how many they have. From that woman who comes from the 7 nations. Guess how many they have? 7. 7. those that you thought were out, they're now in. Those that you thought this wasn't for, it's for them too. The people who thought that God wasn't going to provide for them because he only provided for certain people, turns out he's providing for everyone. He's the God of provision for each and every person. He says 7. And they replied, and a few small fish. And he told the crowd to sit on the ground. And then he took the 7 loaves and the fish. Notice there's lots of 7s. And when he'd given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples. And they turned to the people, and they all ate and were satisfied. Afterwards, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. He says 7 3 times just to make sure we don't miss it. This is not just for some, it is for everyone. The Lord is enough and will provide. If you're here and you're like, yeah, that sounds good for those of you that are like really religious people, and it's like cool for those people who like, yeah, you kind of have this different relationship with God, or for those people who are just having like a really good day, and people who it's like, well, they always have enough because they do just fine. It turns out it's not just for them. It's for everyone. It's for every single person. And so that solves maybe a little bit of who this is for. But the question is, well, what does that mean? Like, what does this actually mean? What does all this mean? If you come back to John chapter 6 with me, we'll be in verse 25. Hopefully you kept your thumb there. But John chapter 6, verse 25. This is where Jesus gets deep into the heart of the bread of life. He says this, when they found him on the other side of the lake, remember, we're now on the other side of the lake, they asked him, Rabbi, when did you get here? Jesus answered, very truly, I tell you, you are looking for me, not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Do you see what he's saying? You fell in love with the creation. You're looking for the bread. You're just here for the meal. You're not here for me. You're looking for the provision, not the provider. That's what you're here for, isn't it? Like you have a physical hunger, but you're not realizing the deeper spiritual thing behind it. He says, you're here for that. Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. For on him, God the Father has placed his seal of approval. When they ask him, what must we do to do the work God requires? Okay, this is the question we're all asking ourselves. If we're being honest, the million-dollar question of following Jesus is like, what do I have to do? And this is what Jesus says. The work of God is this, to believe in the one he sent. Now that sounds really flowery, doesn't it? Like it sounds real flowery to be like, you just have to believe in the one he sent. But practically, what does that mean? Here's my guess, and I could be totally wrong about this. Jesus is saying, here's your choice. You can believe in the scarcity that the world has provided you. You can believe in the fear that the world will tell you over and over again. If you've never heard a politician speak, if you've never heard a world leader try to get people to see things their way, where do they start? With fear. We all start with fear. There's not enough. It's not going to be good enough. There's not going to be enough for everybody. You got to get what's yours. You got to have what you need. He said, you can go that route. You can believe that. There's a choice in belief. You can believe those things. If you've ever been around a workplace that's like toxic and dangerous, you'll see that over and over again. If you've ever been in like a relationship with people who just see everything as a competition, what you'll find is there's always, always, always not enough for both. And Jesus says you can believe that all you want, or you can believe in the one that God sent. You can live with your anxiety if you want to, or you can choose this other thing. You can believe in the one that he has sent. And so they ask him, what sign then will you give that we may see it and believe you? Notice this, they want a sign from him. They don't just want to believe him, they need a sign. And I want you to remember, this is right after he fed 5,000 people. So they're saying like we need our own sign, not from them, but for us. What will you do? Our ancestors ate manna in the wilderness, and it's written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. Now, Jesus says this, very truly, I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you bread from heaven. Remember, it's not coming from anybody else. And you might think this. It's not coming from your boss, though. It's not coming from your friends. It's not coming from the great work you've done. It doesn't come from all the cool stuff that you think is where your sources come from. It comes from me. He says, but it is my Father who gives you true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven, and it gives life to the world. And they say, sir, sir, they said, always give us this bread. Like, that sounds real good. And then Jesus declares, no, it's not like a physical bread. You're seeing the creation, you're missing the creator. I am the bread of life. If you want to believe in that, you don't get to believe in the bread. Don't fall for that. I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. I am that Jireh, that Jehovah Jireh who was enough when Abraham thought he was going to lose everything. When Abraham thought that the one thing that he cared about more than anything, he was going to lose it, Jireh showed up and said, no, I'm enough. In the wilderness, when you were out there wandering around thinking, what are we going to do now? We found this freedom, but we don't know how we're going to take care of ourselves. We have no way of taking care of our own. What is our plan here? God says, well, while you were wandering around there, I was Jireh. I'm still enough. I am the bread of life. Now, what happens is it gets weird. I'm just going to warn you. Because we've talked about like what that means. But what I want you to see now is how do we respond to it? Because this is going to get real weird real fast. Okay? If you've never read the next part, I'm not going to read the whole thing. But I'm going to be honest with you. It sounds like a horror film. It gets real creepy. Jesus starts talking about how you need to like eat from him. Like take bites out of him kind of thing. In verse 53, it says, Jesus tells them, very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. This is like a vampire film. I'm just being honest. It gets real creepy, right? Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise them up on the last day. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. And whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me, I live because of the Father. So the one who feeds on me will live forever. This is the bread that came down from heaven. This is that bread. Your ancestors ate manna and died, but whoever feeds on this bread will live forever. This just got real weird, guys. And you can almost feel, I can feel the disciples. Everybody had just said, this is the bread. This is the guy. This is the prophet we're looking for. You can almost feel the disciples being like, oh no. Oh, like everybody was on board with this, Jesus. Why'd you do that? What are you talking about? Like you can almost sense them just being like, we almost had other people believing in this. We were doing so good. And now you're talking about people eating your flesh. Like, what went so wrong? Why would you do that? Like, nobody wants that billboard. I've never seen, by the way, a church with a billboard that's like, our mission statement is eat Jesus' flesh or anything like that. I've never seen that one. I'd love to see it. I don't want to go to that church though. You know, like that's terrifying. Eat my flesh and drink my blood. You have to do that. It's not great. It's not a great PR move. Jesus does this, by the way, over and over again. Every time you think you're like he's given the easy sales pitch. Jesus never gives an easy sales pitch. He's never like, follow me and all your dreams come true. He never says that. Follow me and everything's going to go perfect for you. In fact, he usually says, follow me. You're going to have to like die daily. Take up your cross. To follow me, you're going to have to give up everything you have. Sell it to the poor. Then you can follow me. He says, this is what I want you to do. Now, for some of you might get a little creeped out by this, and this is a weird teaching. Are you hanging with me, Katie? Are you okay? By the way, guys, this is just a personal thing, but we were at lunch one day, and I don't know how we got on the topic, but you remember that soccer team that landed in South America, and they had to eat each other at one point? There's only like a couple survivors. There's a whole movie about it. And I don't remember how we got on the topic. We kind of brought it up. Like, oh, remember like that soccer team, right? And Katie had like a visceral reaction. Like I thought she was going to throw up Greek food. Like I was like, oh no. And she was like, sorry, I can't talk about cannibalism. And I was like, and she was like, it just gets me every time. And I was like, every time? How often are you talking about cannibalism? And she's like, I can't do it. I can't do it. She's like, it's just every time it makes me, so I don't know if you, don't talk to Katie about this. I actually was going to give you a disclaimer before this teaching. It's not my fault. It's Jesus. It's not even me. Okay. So I'm sorry, but yeah, Katie. So anyways, if you're sensitive, I get it. But that's the whole thing with what Jesus is teaching here. Is actually what he's teaching is that this isn't going to go down easy. This isn't going to be easy for you to comprehend or for you to take in. I remember when I was a kid, my grandparents, they had a huge farm. They still have pretty good chunks of it out in Oklahoma, on the panhandle of Oklahoma. If you don't know where the panhandle of Oklahoma is, don't worry, nobody else does either. Nobody lives there. There's nothing there. The nearest airport is about 3 hours away, and it's small. And I have to go there this summer to be there, and I can't wait. It's a thriving metropolis. They live in a little town called Texhoma, Oklahoma. It's on the border of Texas and Oklahoma. And they have a huge farm. And they grow wheat, and they grow alfalfa, which is not just a little rascal. It's like a real grain. And they have cattle, and they have sheep and stuff like that. And I remember going out there, and I had been in Haiti for a couple weeks, and I flew, and we went to Oklahoma right after. And in Haiti, they have sugar cane. Anybody had like just straight sugar cane, where you just cut off the top of a sugar cane and you start? It's fantastic. It's so good. If you haven't had that. And so we were in Oklahoma, and I kind of thought like, well, all farms are probably the same thing, right? So I just picked up some wheat that was growing, and I put it in my mouth. And my grandfather was like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "Well, I think I'm just going to eat some wheat." And he's like, "You don't eat wheat." And I was like, "Why don't you eat wheat?" He's like, "You don't eat wheat." And he was like, "It's going to make you really sick." I was like, "I don't think so, because like it's in bread, like, right? Like wheat's a main thing." He's like, "Oh yeah, it's in bread, but it's not like that." And so, like I would carry it like that straw in my mouth, type of thing. But then I thought I could just like eat the other part. He's like, you don't eat wheat. Now, why is that? It's true. If you eat wheat straight, you will be wicked sick. It's not made for you to eat directly. Wheat goes through a massive amount of change until it is fully understood, until it's fully used. You have to take it, you separate the wheat from the chaff. We used to take these combines out. Anybody ever seen like the big combines that you would take out, the big tractors, and it would gather up all the wheat, and it would separate the wheat from the chaff? I'll never forget, I had a pastor one time preach about farming. He was talking about something else, but he was talking about farming, and he was talking about a combine. He was a pastor that I grew up with. His name's Gary. And Gary was talking about the combines, and he never said the word combines the entire sermon. He called them concubines the entire time. And it wasn't our best service. And after the service, I told him, I was like, "Hey, Gary, you said concubines the whole time." He's like, "What's that?" I was like, "Oh, come on, man." And I was like, they bring in just a whole different kind of harvest. It's just a different situation. Anyways, but we would take the combines out, and we would gather, and it would gather the wheat, and it would separate the wheat from the chaff. What needs to happen, then then you would take that wheat and you would put it in the granary, and in the granary it would actually be beaten down. It would be actually destroyed until it was like smushed into small pieces, and it would form these little tiny beads. Then the beads had to be smushed down into like a flour type of powder, and that's when it finally was actually usable. It wasn't something you could just eat, or you could just take it in and digest it yourself. It needed a whole refining process. There are many times I think the stories and the teachings of Jesus are a lot like this. To take them at face value might sound easy or it might sound simple, but when we get down into it, it really requires a full process to understand them. Like we all like the stories of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus that are like, you're going to be great and the world's going to love you and you're going to prosper or whatever. We love the stories of forgiveness where he forgives us, but if we're being honest, we don't like the parts about forgiving other people. Or we like the parts where he talks about you're going to have great relationships if you follow these things, but we also don't like the sexual ethic that he teaches. Like we like parts of it. We like the parts where he talks about, I'm going to give you what you need, but also you might not be rich. Right? We like parts of the teaching, but once that we have to like really chew on them for a while. We have to take them in. And that's what he's saying here is I'm not actually like that simple to understand. This is a lot more difficult than you think. It's not just at face value. And to do this, it's going to be really hard work. was reading in our guys' Bible study. By the way, if you're a guy and you want to get up early on a Thursday morning, you're welcome to join us. We meet at Panera Bread because we're religious, and this is about bread. That's why we go there. And so we meet there every Thursday morning. Anybody's welcome to join us. We're reading a book right now by one of my favorite authors. It's kind of a modern author. And in that, he talks about that right now there is kind of a difference of people that are following Jesus, saying that they are truly following, like they're actually practicing in part of that, and then how few people are just saying, I'm a Christian. Now, there's a big difference between those two things. Saying I'm a Christian, checking that box, pretty easy. Those that are saying I'm like actually following Jesus on a day-to-day basis, very few. Some people would say that percentage is as low as 4%, where in our nation, 73% of people say they're Christians. But inside of that, he says that there's about 10% of people who would be called resilient followers. I don't know about you if you've ever been a resilient follower of Jesus. Maybe not. Maybe you're too young in this. Maybe this is all new to you. This is why there's great authors who say things like, God cannot use you until he's hurt you. For many of us, I think there's this part of us that once we fall into these places where it like hurts us a little bit, we get disappointed and we don't know where to go. We have things that don't help us the way we want them to. Not everything is up and to the right with Jesus. It's not all perfect anymore. Then we start to fall off. We're not resilient followers. We're followers as long as it works for me. We're followers as long as I like it. And then, it's enough. And what happens here is Jesus saying it's going to be a tough slog. It's going to be harder than you think, but it's going to be worth it. And he turns, it actually says right after that, on verse 60, it says, on hearing this, many of the disciples said, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? And if you skip down, verse 66 says, from this time on, many followers turned back and no longer followed him. I'm just saying, after the feeding of the 5,000, you would think he would have more followers than ever, wouldn't you? But then he turns to Peter, and Peter, this is a risky move. He turns to Peter, verse 67. He says, you do not want to leave too, do you? Jesus asked the 12. And Simon Peter answered him, and Peter doesn't often get things right. But he says, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God. Pete doesn't get things right very often, but man, he nails it here, doesn't he? You are the one with the words of life. Where else are we going to go? And for some of us, I think we need to learn that tension of fighting with God. I had a person here, we had some people here in Easter who had been through some really difficult things, and they said that they had lost some people recently in their life, that they'd had some people pass away suddenly, some terrible things had happened. And on Easter in this room, we prayed together at the end of service. And as I usually do, by the way, I don't believe in kind of the magic prayer. You pray this prayer, you're going to heaven immediately. I just don't think that's quite how it works. Jesus never did that, so it doesn't seem like a real thing to me. But I believe that we should be talking to Jesus. I believe there's a relationship there. And so I said in that message, I said something along the lines of like, consider this a group text where I'm introducing you to again. And I'll be the middleman who introduces you back to Jesus, and you guys take the conversation from there. And this person told me that that was the first time that they had talked to Jesus in 18 months because they were so mad at him. And I was like, that's exactly where you might need to be. She was like, really? I was like, yeah, that's kind of how this works sometimes. Remember, God names Israel one who wrestles with God. That's what it means, one who wrestles with God. Islam means one who submits to God, just flat submission. Israel means one who wrestles with. And I look at Peter in this and I'm like, this is a tough teaching. This is a tough teaching, but he's saying, no, I will wrestle through it. The point is not that you're maybe you have that right now where you have some kind of blockage between you and God, and maybe you're a little upset with him, or maybe something's happened where you're disappointed. Maybe you don't feel like he's going to provide for you. Maybe you're nervous that he's not going to come through this time. Maybe you're like, I don't see it happening. Well, the best thing is not to cut off the communication. The point is to wrestle with him through it. And so Peter says, where else are we going to go? You have the words to eternal life. And how we respond to that is everything. Because those disciples that stayed with Jesus from that point, they got to celebrate Passover with him. They got to celebrate Passover. They got to sit with him at a meal that he said, I've eagerly awaited having this meal with you. And they had what we would now call the Last Supper together. I heard recently that there are 3 phrases that are the happiest phrases. Literally, there was a study done on happiness. I heard recently that there's a study done on happiness, and there are 3 phrases that make you the happiest of any 3 phrases. The first is, I love you. Like, literally, it raises the happiness level in a person. The second is, I forgive you. And the third is, it's time for dinner. That's a true study. It's almost like that's what Jesus is setting up here. Is he's setting up this time of Passover where he says, I am the bread of life. I will be enough for you. You don't have to believe and carry anxiety anymore. You don't have to be stressed and worried anymore. But guess what? I love you. I forgive you. And it's time for dinner. And so this morning, as we close, what I want to do is just give you a chance to respond to that in your own way. There might be things right now, if we're being honest, that there are things that are keeping you up at night. There are some things that are stressing you out. There are some things that have had you worried. And I want you to have some time just to come and take communion, take this Last Supper, take this Passover meal where Jesus says, I am the bread. And he's the bread of life. And that he's giving this to us as a free gift. And we can believe all the other lies of this world, or we can believe him and believe that he really is enough, that he is Jehovah Jireh, that he has been enough, and that he will provide. So we're going to sing for just a little bit, but as you take communion, what I'd encourage you to do, you're welcome to come take it in our church. It's open. If you believe in Jesus, you're welcome to take communion. It's that simple. You can come take it. You can take it back to your seat. And I'd encourage you just to take it at your own pace today. Just whatever works for you. Spend some time in prayer. And really, at the end of the day, just accept this bread of life. Accept the tough things and accept the things and begin that conversation again with Jesus if you've cut that off as well. But we want to come together because this is why Jesus says this is the first impression he gives us. Is because he wants you to know that you can trust him and he will provide for you. That he is enough. So let's pray together, and then you're welcome to come take communion at your own leisure. Let's stand as we do that. Jesus, I thank you for your words. I thank you that you are the bread of life and that you're enough for us. Thank you for the promise that you give us that no matter what the world teaches us or the way that we come to understand, the anxiety that we carry, the stress that we have every day, the worry that we cannot seem to get away from, that you tell us, no, that you're enough. And for so many of us, that's a tough teaching because we want to believe that we are enough. We want to believe that we have enough, or that we can make enough, or that we can create enough. We want to see the creator, the creation, and we want to worship that creation that we can manage and we can handle instead of the creator behind it. And today, Jesus, we see you for who you are, that you